All right, we are being recorded. So here we go. This is the official kickoff of our webinar. So hello everybody, this is Kevin Moll. I'm the Executive Director of the RISE Association. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. This is, as you can see from the slide, put on your thinking cap and develop a map. And this is the latest in the series of webinars that RISE puts on for the association members. It's a free benefit of membership. And we're recording today's event, and the slide deck will be available for everybody. We'll send you out an email afterwards and get you a copy of the slide deck and a copy of the recording. It'll be coming out in about 2 days. So as you can see from the slide on the screen here, the member portal is the new happy thing. We've got a lot of people who have converted their membership. They've been members for a long time and they've gotten their passwords and everything to get into the portal. And that portal will provide you access to copies of these past webinar recordings. You'll be able to replay those and go through the slide decks and everything. So it's a great thing, and we're really happy to be able to have that member portal for everybody. Lots of cool things inside of the member portal. So before I introduce our speaker today, I'm gonna just make sure everybody knows everyone's on silent during this, all the participants who are attending here today. And if you look down at the very bottom, you take the cursor and hover down below, you're gonna see a Q&A box. You can click on that box and pop a question in for us, and we'll take those questions. We'll pull those questions into the Q&A at the end of the session. And also, you'll note if you click on the chat box, you can see that Tracy Anderson, our marketing coordinator, has put up a phone number for you in case you have trouble with the audio and want to use your phone to call in and get the audio and watch the video part of this Zoom meeting on your computer. Sometimes that works really well for people, so that's an option. Make sure you stay tuned in for the whole event, because at the very end we're going to put a little poll up on the screen to give you a poll to give us your feedback on your experience with the webinar. Really appreciate the feedback we get. That helps us with the quality of our webinar experiences. Let's see, I think we've covered all of that with the housekeeping stuff. So now for the fun part here, I'm very pleased to introduce a good friend of mine, Dawn Carter. Dawn Carter is, as you can see, Director of Product Strategy for Centauri Health Solutions. Centauri Health Solutions is the sponsor of this webinar today, and they are a community partner of RISE. If you want to take a look at the menu of services Centauri provides, you can log into the member portal. We have a service directory there that'll give you a whole mapping of all the things that they do and services that they provide. More about Dawn here, besides the fact that she's a grandmother to a grandchild out in Japan right now. She, as a product strategy director, she comes with 26 years of experience in the industry, mostly and most recently with extensive experience in developing revenue integrity and quality software solutions with a focus on encounter management and risk adjustment solutions for Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, and commercial health plans. Prior to that, her experience spans all domains of healthcare, including health plan and provider systems administration and healthcare applications development. Her experience also includes multiple teaching engagements in medical administration, billing, and coding. Dawn holds a bachelor's degree in business administration, and she's a passionate, prolific industry speaker, author, blogger, and subject matter expert in claims, EDI management, and risk adjustment. Dawn has spoken many times at a number of the RISE conferences over the years, and that's where I had the lovely opportunity to make her acquaintance and become friends over the years. So Dawn, with that, why don't you take it away and tell us about the thinking cap and the map?
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us. Lovely introduction. And of course, congratulations on your upcoming retirement. For those in the audience who don't know, Kevin will be retiring after a long and illustrious career with the RISE Association. And so I'm extra excited that he's chosen to join us today as we talk about putting on a thinking cap and developing a map. And so he's told you a little bit about me and my experience. And so I'm going to ask Tracy to pop up our first poll question. I'm going to start right away, making sure that everybody's had their coffee and their afternoon snack and ready for the first poll question. And this one is, how many years of experience do you have in risk adjustment? And first choice is, I am new to the industry. And if you are, welcome. It's an exciting industry. Second is less than 5 years, but more than a year. Third is more than 5 years, but less than the time that we have been required to submit EDPS. And last, I remember when there was no EDPS. So a little bit of humor there. I think most old timers like myself, do remember when there was no EDPS, and certainly remember that fateful day in October of 2010. CMS said, we're cutting over. It was from RAPS to EDPS, and then it was all the tremendous flurry of activity getting ready for that. All right. So as you're putting in those poll questions, I myself, like Kevin said, I have 10 years of experience in risk adjustment, although my career spans 26 years in basically in revenue cycle. But I've been on the dark side, the vendor side now for about 10 years in risk adjustment with a focus, most of my focus on data submissions in general, since I do have EDI background. All right, Tracy. So let's see. We have about 10% of folks are new to the industry. So of course, this webinar, of course, will be very helpful to you and certainly encourage you to reach out, afterwards if you have questions. I enjoy mentoring people and answering questions, as a lot of the old timers here will tell you that know me. The majority of you, 65% less than 5 years, but more than a year. 15% more than 5 years, but less than the time we've been required to submit EDPS, which most of you know now is 8 years. Because we were required to start in 2012. And then I remember when there was no EDPS, 10%. So a couple of folks like myself who remember that. So wonderful. And so Tracy, if you want to close that out, we'll actually move on to poll question number 2, just a further question for me to kind of get to know, who I'm talking to today in the audience. And this is about your level of experience in industry. And so we've got your roles within the organization. So Tracy, if you want to pop that second poll up there, we've got some choices concerning what your role is. And the first being, you are the director of all things risk adjustment, including submissions and coding. Second is you do reporting and analytics for risk adjustment. And third, you, like myself, about 80% of my job is product management for risk adjustment related products and services. And then last but certainly not least, our friends who are consultants, individual contributors, and subject matter experts. So pop your knowledge in there just so I can kind of know who we're talking to today, although my content, of course, is relevant to anyone in those roles, particularly if you're a director of all things risk adjustment, because sometimes, the submissions related content is not as much, other than what the monthly or bi-monthly CMS calls and HPMS memos and things that come your way. All right, Tracy. So who do we have here today? All right, about 19% of you are director of all things risk adjustment, including submissions and coding. 31% of you are reporting and analytics for risk adjustment. 13% of you are product management for risk adjustment. And then 38% of you are consultant, individual contributors, and subject matter experts. All right. So thank you for sharing that with me. Tracy, you can advance ahead to the next slide. And so although Kevin did already introduce me, I wanted to, a lot of you know that I like to get really creative with my presentations. And so I wanted to actually just present another little introduction of myself, aside from the fact that I have been in healthcare for 26 years, 10 years on the risk adjustment side. I write and I blog and I speak on all things risk adjustment. But I also thought as I was developing this presentation about the map analogy, and it's appropriate because as we develop strategies, we use the CMS reporting as waypoints on a map. And this is an analogy that comes easily to me because I have been section hiking the Appalachian Trail for a number of years now. And that's actually some of you out there I know are well known to me, probably know that. And so I've been doing this, picking away at it for quite some time. And on the Appalachian Trail, white blazes serve as fairly reputable waypoints, but we also have to have maps to plan for food and shelter, locate and plan for trail hazards and elevation, as well as locate the scenic views, and certainly not to get lost. And so I think a map analogy is an apt one as we consider how we use CMS reporting as waypoints on the map that we're developing so that we don't have to submit corrective action plans or anything else of that nature. So that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. And as such, on the next slide, we've got some learning objectives. History and summary of CMS EDPS reporting, inclusive of the new 2020 data exchange reporting. It's been a while, I think, since anybody in the industry's talked about the reporting, because over the years, we've gained quite a collection of reporting. And so specific, of course, for Medicare Advantage. So we'll talk about that. How to develop proactive strategies for the people, processes, and technology as a compass for your map to address gaps identified in reporting. How you respond with a thoughtful corrective action plan that addresses the root cause of gaps, and this is mostly relevant for these new data exchange reports that were released earlier this year. And then special considerations for the HEDIS input necessary to address these gaps and to open the conversation about the intersection of risk adjustment and quality. So since the announcement, of course, of the transition in late 2010, this reporting has evolved tremendously. And like I had mentioned earlier, it can be hard sometimes to track down information on CMS websites and other resources about what reporting is available and what its content is. And accountability is the most important pillar of a successful organization and is the key to engagement, performance, and profitability and managing change. Therefore, it is very important that you understand reporting and how to effectively use it to set key performance indicators for data submission and risk adjustment operations that maximize payment accuracy and financial success. So we're going to talk a lot about key performance indicators today, and we call them KPIs for short. So you'll hear a lot about that. All right, so moving along, as promised, we'll do just a little bit of a history lesson here. And some of you may remember that in October of 2010, CMS announced its intention to transition from the 5 data element RAPS format for the submission of member diagnosis data for the purposes of risk adjustment to the X12837 Healthcare Claims Electronic Data Interchange Standard, say that 5 times fast, which has hundreds of data elements. At the time, they intended for the transition to conclude by 2015, but here we are in 2020 and risk score calculations are still blended at 75% EDPS, 25% RAPS for payment year 2021 as announced in last year's final notice. However, it is important to point out that the delay was necessary in order for CMS to address GAO and OIG concerns regarding the quantity and quality of the data they were receiving. The result of OIG and GAO's audit findings and recommendations for CMS resulted in the various reports that you see here. We'll take a look at each of these reports and spend some time on the 2020 data exchange reports due to their unique content compared to the others. This will be a good refresher for the industry veterans in our audience, and for the newer folks, a helpful guide to the reports that are critical for the understanding of the operational and financial status of your risk adjustment programs. If you are newer to risk adjustment, it is important also to know that these reports are issued through the CMS Health Plan Management System, and the acronym for that is HPMS, which requires a subscription to a listserv that announces when they are available, and then the plan must log into HPMS to download the reports. So that's an important point in case you are new and you're wondering where these things come from. And here, of course, we have the timeline that talks about when the transition was first announced. Then when we had various GAO audits that resulted in our report cards, the annual operational reports, and then of course the data exchange reports, which are new for 2020. So we're gonna take a little bit of a dive on each of these just as a little refresher. And so we'll continue and first talk about the CMS report cards. Of course, on the right side of each slide, I have a little graphic of kind of what it looks like, just in case. So here for our CMS report cards, these have been issued quarterly since 2016, and they're generally released in January, March, June, and September, and have undergone various changes since that time. CMS, as a lot of the veterans in the audience know, is generally very responsive to feedback about reporting and things of that nature because they want it to be useful. They want to help their health plans be successful. And this is, the report cards have evolved tremendously since 2016. And they report on basically the volume, frequency, and quality against fee-for-service and plans in the same region of similar size. So there's some comparison in there against cohorts, which is often very helpful. The plans actually used to identify outliers. So if a plan seemed to be, not in line with its peers, it would be identified as an outlier, but CMS no longer does that. And generally on these reports, these are used these are a good way to set your KPIs for volume, frequency, and quality. So for example, setting a volume KPI for every claim that you have that is adjudicated on the claim side, because remember, claims and encounters are different. An encounter is sent and accepted, as well as a RAPS submission when indicated, because we know that RAPS is a smaller subset of data than EDPS. So that's a good volume indicator. What you've got coming in from your providers is what you've got going out on EDPS. And if that's not happening and you're missing deadlines, you want to figure out why. For frequency, of course, submissions have to be made at least monthly. CMS has published, and this has long been the case, that at the very bare minimum, plans have to submit monthly, but larger plans should be submitting more frequently, and there is guidance in CMS's documentation about that. And then quality. This is a little bit harder to set KPIs for, but a good place to start is your rejections as they're reported on your 999s, your 277 CAs, and your MAO2s, which are those responses that come when you submit a file to CMS. And you want to make sure they don't surpass a set threshold for each encounter type. So we have institutional, professional, and durable medical equipment, DME. And you want to make sure that you set an appropriate threshold to make sure that you are also, examining the root cause of those rejections and figuring out how you can address that gap. So those are the report cards. Next, we have our annual operational metrics. These came a little later, and they are also called performance reports. These ones are issued annually in August and have been since 2019. So these are relatively new. They're similar to report cards, except there are no comparisons against fee-for-service, nor the peers, and they are more high level. And they have metrics that fall into two categories. Operational, such as is the plan certified to submit, and are they doing so regularly? And completeness. And they do this by looking at submission volume for inpatient, outpatient, and professional encounters. And you're kind of given a red light, green light situation. Are you meeting the metric or are you not? So for health plans that are not new and have been submitting for a while, the O1 and O2 measures, and you can see them here in the little snip that I've got, those are not usually an issue and don't really require KPIs because it's like being pregnant. You either are certified or you're not certified, either one. And O3 doesn't really require a KPI. And the reason for this is because CMS discourages a practice called dumping. And some of you may be familiar with this, which is caused when submissions are not made regularly and or retrospective campaigns are not timed appropriately, which results in a massive data dump near the sweeps deadline for the submission window. So CMS has a metric set, and I believe it's around 20%. They look at how much volume is being submitted in the months prior to a sweep deadline. And if it surpasses a certain threshold, it'll be identified on the metrics because they can't handle massive data dumps. Now, C1 through C4 measures correspond with those KPIs for volume, frequency, and quality. So if you have set these and use your report cards to gauge your progress, you should never have a red light for any of these annual measures. And now it's time for poll question number 3. So I'm going to pop that up there, Tracy. All right, testing your knowledge. In June 2017, CMS published a list of best practices for EDPS submissions. How many are there? A, 5, B, 12, C, 15, and D, they published a list. Hopefully nobody chooses D. Now this, and of course, as everybody's popping in their answers there, I actually did a blog series and a recorded webinar series on the best practices and how to implement them. And of course, every plan's people, processes, and technologies to do this is unique as a fingerprint, but it was very helpful. And Gretchen and I are actually getting ready to dust those off and republish those. So certainly if it's something you're interested in, check out our website as we do that. And and you can find that content, and I publish it like a toolbox theme. All right, so let's see what we have here in terms of our polls. All right, first answer is 5, that was 14%, 12, 57%, 15, 0%, and 29 said they published a list. Oh no, we gotta get you guys that list. So the correct answer is 12. There are actually 12 best practices for EDPS submissions, and those serve actually, again, as good if you are absolutely kind of lost as to where to start, or you want to make sure that you are in line with what the reports are telling you. Those 12 best practices are a really good place to start for setting KPIs. All right. So let's move along and talk about those KPIs, our key performance indicators. Like I said, my map analogy, given that I'm a hiker and I'm all about waypoints, so I'll call them our waypoints. So a good place to start to develop a good map and appropriate KPIs, as I mentioned earlier, is to ensure that your data submissions operations are aligned with those best practices for volume, frequency, and accuracy. I also, as I mentioned, did a webinar and blog series, so you can check that out because it will give you some good information about key performance indicators. More importantly, it should be very clear in your standard operational procedures, the strategies for meeting these KPIs. And the single most important strategy is to align your claims operations with your encounter operations. Claims and encounters are not the same, as I mentioned earlier, but both have the same origin, the providers. Therefore, strategies that are as close to the providers as possible are the most desirable. This may require some additional provider outreach and education, but as you will later see, this additional attention is well worth the investment in risk-adjusted dollars and quality of care. Also, it goes without saying that it's not effective to set KPIs if you do not have visibility into whether or not you are meeting them at any given point in time. In the market today, as a lot of you know, are many automated business intelligence tools that provide this visibility, including those at Centauri that we provide for the reporting of data completeness and accuracy, as well as EDPS and RAPS comparative analytics that proactively identify gaps in completeness and accuracy that affect risk-adjusted payments. So next, let us turn our attention to the most recently released CMS reporting, which is the data exchange reports. And these, of course, require some special consideration when using them to set KPIs. They will also require special attention from others outside of risk adjustment, as you will soon see. All right, so new for 2020, data exchange reports. And of course, on the right-hand side, here's a little snip of what they look like. Now, CMS intends for these to be issued twice per year. And CMS actually had intended, I think, to release them a little bit earlier, but sometime in Q1, but they were actually released in June of 2020. And CMS, has the intention of doing this twice per year. And I think because of COVID, we've not, seen a second round, and they've not, set a schedule yet. And because, of course, it's been dealing with COVID. We knew that these were coming. In early 2019, CMS interacted with various health plans that were identified to have significant gaps between traditional HEDIS and HEDIS calculated on encounter data to understand the root causes of gaps. And I actually had the opportunity to sit in on this interaction with CMS on behalf of one of our clients who was identified from a HEDIS perspective. And so that was actually very informative, and that's kind of where I went kind of on red alert, like, okay, this is coming, and sure enough, here we are. So what CMS is doing with these reports is they took 4 HEDIS measures, and they're identified here, where they and they 4 HEDIS measures, as well as some other data quality measures that are outside of the 277 and MAO2 level of editing. And so what they, and a lot of people kind of were shaking, scratching their heads saying, why were these not really incorporated as edits? Now we're going to have to add additional checks into our data, which is true, because these are not things that that are often incorporated into a rules engine. So hopefully you're using a tool that allows that, or you can have these incorporated, of course, into the front end, because some of these are asking for dates that you can't really, it's not easy to go back and get from providers. So you want to require that from the outset so that you're getting that data and not having to go back later to get it, which can cause provider abrasion. So one of the things that makes this report, other than reporting on the 4 HEDIS measures as well as these remaining data quality measures, it requires health plans to submit a corrective action plan when the organization does not meet the CMS metric. And so that's something different. CMS has not required that in terms of the other reports, as to why there might be, issues with data volume, frequency, or completeness, or any of those things. And CMS's clear intention is to eventually use encounter data to calculate measures. And it makes sense because we talk a lot in our industry and even at RISE about the intersection of risk adjustment and quality. And there is one. And so it makes sense from a data perspective to be going that way as well. So continuing with our special consideration theme, I kind of broke down these reports for you because there's 2 sections. There's what I call the HEDIS section and the non-HEDIS section. And the non-HEDIS section is those 7 additional data quality validations with the inclusion of members that have absolutely no encounter data records included, and then those that have a chart review as their only source of data. So because of these things, they require some additional consideration when setting your key performance indicators. And by doing this, hopefully it will prevent you from having to submit a corrective action plan to CMS when gaps are found. So we'll start with a non-HEDIS related section here. And we talked about, and I often get at, what is the CRR no EDR? That is when unlinked chart review data has been received and no encounter. And most of you in risk adjustment are probably familiar with the report that the OIG issued recently regarding some of their concerns about unlinked chart review data. And so any day now we expect CMS to set a metric for that, in terms of how much of the overall supplemental data volume can be sent unlinked versus linked. So that's something important, to be aware of, if you've not, heard about, this ongoing concern with CMS. They feel that there should be an encounter, present for everything, and there should never be this scenario except for maybe in-home assessments. So, continue to look for communications from CMS, about this situation. So as I talked about earlier, these 7 additional data quality validations should be integrated into your claims front-end editing to ensure that providers send this data up front. Now, this may require you to interface with claims or IT resources that are responsible for maintaining the claims rules engine, or with your clearinghouse, because a lot of places still use clearinghouses. Their rules engines are not maintained in-house. This not only prevents being included as a gap, but also prevents provider abrasion and having to go back to the provider long after the claim has been paid to get that data. 2 of these edits are related to the validity of billing and rendering NPIs, and CMS has indicated that to prevent these gaps, it is recommended to use their monthly deactivated NPI file to do an additional pre-submission validity check for the billing and provider NPIs. So for those members with no encounter data records, it is generally understood that there will always be a small number of members who truly receive no services, and the easiest way to prove this when responding to CMS with a CAP is to provide screenshots or other reporting from the claims adjudication system for these members. Early identification of members with no claims could be added as a KPI when you're setting yours. Now, for members identified that had chart review submissions with no encounter data submission corresponding to it, frequent interrogation of unlinked chart review records volume is important here. CMS, as I mentioned, eventually intends to set a metric for how much of overall chart review volume can be submitted as unlinked. And they won't accept, we don't have the technical resources to write matching and linking logic as an excuse for submitting everything as unlinked. Because believe it or not, I still hear that sometimes when I'm doing some strategic advisory services is we don't have the resources to do this. But soon it's, CMS is just going to draw the line and say, here's the metric and you have to do what you need to do to meet that. So how should you respond to a CAP here? Well, CMS is generally looking for prevention strategies here. And the best one is to state that edits are being placed in the inbound claims from providers to catch these issues proactively, plain and simple. It is always best to place the intervention as close to the data source as possible, which in this case is the providers. After implementation, set a KPI for the reduction in these errors and run reporting at least monthly to gauge progress and adjust after root cause analysis if needed. And so this is going to require some EDI knowledge on your report because you may, as you are setting this KPI and wanting to see, reduction in errors, these claims and encounters will meet specific criteria from an 837 perspective. And so you'll need to know how to identify them. So you'll need a claims resource who's well-versed in EDI and probably a technical resource to help with query writing. Just some suggestions. So moving on, we consider with some other, special considerations here. And this is like the HEDIS side. So we talked about the non-HEDIS side of these reports. Now we have HEDIS. And of course, they started with 4 measures. We have post-discharge medication reconciliation, breast cancer screening, colon cancer screening, and diabetic eye exams. And so the best way to kind of, address these and prevent from having to submit a corrective action plan is to construct and run queries to mine for affected encounters based on the HEDIS specifications for the measures. And this is largely HCPC and CPT based and is specified by the measures documentation. You might need to get that from the HEDIS staff because they're typically the ones who maintain that, and it changes from year to year, and it's quite a large body of information. You might even want to have, set up a liaison. Again, now we've entered that intersection of risk adjustment and quality. A proactive step, might be, okay, we need a liaison for this now, and having that person actually facilitating this process. And of course, CMS gives a sample of the members. They don't list every member, of course, on these reports, just a sample of them by MBI that they looked at when they calculated the measure for which they did not find a match. Some of the things you want to ask when you're looking at this is, were any of the encounters sent to EDPS and rejected? Because that can cause a gap. If so, are you addressing the root cause for these rejections and resubmitting? Again, going back even further, if not, why not? And then, just continue with peeling back I call it peeling back the onion to find out, why, in terms of looking at that gap, why the encounters aren't there. A lot of times it's because of these EDPS rejections and trying to figure out, what's not happening. And then sometimes going all the way back to the provider because the claim was not submitted or something happened or it was pended or appealed or something else happened. So this can be a little difficult to do, but well worth the time of a liaison to help do that. So for those encounters that do not appear to have a submission to CMS, or those claims that do not appear to have a submission to CMS in an encounter, you want to do some of the same mining against the inbound claims adjudication system to determine if there is even a claim from a provider. It could be that the claim is being held or pended, as I mentioned earlier, for some reason, or was rejected back to the provider. And of course, what are those root causes of those rejections or pens, and what is being done to address those? So peeling back the onion on that as well. So lots of root cause analysis and trying to figure out, why these gaps might exist. So this gives you just some things to think about. So another special consideration in terms of dealing with the HEDIS side of the equation in these reports is HEDIS supplemental data. And of course, this is not to be confused with EDPS supplemental data, which of course is diagnosis data that comes from chart reviews and other retrospective activities, as well as prospective activities like in-home assessments. This is HEDIS data that is not claims-based and comes largely from interactions with members over the telephone and via other means that do not necessarily get submitted as a claim. A good example is that measure post-discharge medication reconciliation. These interactions are not claims-based. Usually it's folks following up with people on the telephone and other things that are happening that don't incur a claim. So the HEDIS team may have to tell you how many of these non-claim-based interactions there were and provide you documentation of them for your systems, from their systems. It is important to consider this data source as you analyze for quote-unquote true gaps between encounter-based HEDIS versus traditionally calculated HEDIS and report gap closure with this data in your corrective action plan. This is very important information for CMS to consider as they move forward with adding more HEDIS measures to future data exchange reporting. And as I said earlier, CMS is very, very receptive to feedback, information. In fact, one of our health plans, when these reports came and they found having to, engage for this HEDIS supplemental data, is like, did they not consider this when they chose these measures? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but they need to know that information as they continue moving forward and some of the challenges that you may or may not be having getting this. So definitely let them know your feedback, because they do like to hear from people and they do consider it as they develop their policies. Now, it's also worth mentioning that because we are, as I have before, because we're now standing at that intersection of risk adjustment and quality, that if you're using vendors for risk adjustment and quality, it may be helpful for them to be the same vendor. The reason for this is because although Risk Adjustment Operations owns the data that CMS has included in that gap analysis, the HEDIS team's input is critical for effectively developing a complete and accurate corrective action plan if it's required, largely due to their ownership and understanding of the HEDIS specifications, as well as providing that supporting analysis related to the supplemental data for HEDIS. Certainly the two vendors are not required to be the same, but by now you can clearly see why it would be advantageous for them to be the same. And so now we come to our polling question number 4. You can pop that up there. So when responding to CMS with a corrective action plan to address gaps identified on these data exchange reports, which of these is an acceptable statement? A, the dog ate mine counters. B, the providers send bad data and there's no way we can make them send good data. C, it costs too much to add the resources we need to address these gaps. And D, none of the above. They are looking for proactive strategies for addressing the gaps. Hopefully no one chooses A. All right. So let's see. Let's see what everybody's thinking here.
Looks like we have a few more people still voting, but I'm getting ready to.
All right. Very good. Okay, so luckily no one chose the dog ate mine counters. 6% chose the providers send bad data and there's no way we can make them send good data. 0% said it costs too much to add the resources we need to address these gaps. And 94% said none of the above. They are looking for proactive strategies for addressing the gaps. Of course, none of the above is the correct answers. The reason why we can't use the providers send bad data is because CMS is looking for proactive ways to address gaps. And to shift the blame to the provider, CMS is going to say, you know, they're your providers. You know, what do you, you know, yes, you can make them send good data. And the way to do that is, you know, either by incorporate, or usually it's a combination of putting edits in the front end system that require this data up front. And of course, educating them that these edits are there. And then doing provider education, helping them understand, you know, why this is necessary. It's a compliance issue with CMS. And then, you know, down the road, it could, you know, affect utilization, quality of care, and other ways that CMS uses this data. So it's not, you know, intended to be an onerous rule. It is truly something that is used for a variety of purposes by CMS. And of course, incorporating it into the editing so that they get used to it is a good way to start that, along with that provider education. So moving along. Along that same vein, I decided I would include a slide that says what not to say when you're doing your corrective action planning. And look what's at the top. The providers are sending bad data. There's no way we can force them to send good data. So I have here, if not, consider modifying your contract language to include data quality expectations and KPIs. I've actually seen some plans do this. You know, I've been doing this now for 10 years, and some health plans have actually done that. Some plans choose not to, and that's fine too. But usually at the very least, they'll put in some those data quality checks that I was mentioning, so that information is gotten up front from the providers before the claim is even adjudicated, so it can be sent right away. So that's why you'd not want to say that. So we have also the aspect of I always ask this question when I talk to people about this. It's like, are you in the business to lose money or be out of compliance with CMS? Because you don't want to be either of those things. So that's kind of a justification for, you know, doing what you need to do to get that data, from the good data, from the outset. Because this can mean lost revenue, and it can also mean, you know, having to spend the time and resources to submit a corrective action plan needlessly. Lost revenue also means negative effects for members' care. So providers really do need to care about what is submitted at each point in the revenue cycle. And so the return on investment for that is actually very high. So the second thing you probably don't want to say when you're corrective action planning is, our systems don't have a way to catch these issues proactively, or it costs too much money to modify or replace our systems. And quite simply, you need then to get ones that do, or engage a vendor that can help you with this. And certainly there are many very fine vendors in this space that do this kind of work. The ROI for these systems can easily be proven with improved payment accuracy from less rejected encounters, and it is relatively easy to calculate with help from risk adjustment analytics. And so Centauri also can help you. We do this kind of work as well. And so that ROI is there. And you're going to see a slide here and a couple of slides after the next polling question that can show you the financial impact of this missing data and how you can easily extrapolate, you know, the cost savings for these people, processes, and technology that will help you catch these things proactively. And so last but not least, I have here, it will take too long. We don't have the IT resources to implement edits or modify systems. Well, CMS isn't going to find this acceptable either. And like the above, the one prior, the ROI for these resources is very clear, as you're going to see on a slide here upcoming. So can you afford not to have these resources for implementation and oversight? So not having the resources is completely unacceptable to CMS. You know, they're going to want to know, you know, okay, how are you going to get those resources? You know, especially when they know, because they've also been doing this a long time, the ROI for getting these resources is very high and is very necessary. All right. So next we come to our last polling question. In the recently released Part 1 of the Payment Year 2022 Advance Notice, and so this is one that just came out, CMS proposed which percentage of EDPS and RAPS blending for risk score calculation, respectively. A, roll back to 50-50, so 50% RAPS, 50% EDPS. B, unchanged from 2021 at 75% EDPS, 25% RAPS. C, increase the EDPS to 85% and then 15% RAPS, or 100% EDPS all the way. Let's get rid of RAPS already. So pop your answers in there. And just as a hint, one of the reasons that I'm mentioning this is because no matter what is decided, you know, we're moving forward with the transition away from RAPS. And so it becomes all the more important for health plans to have the appropriate people, processes, and technology, and the appropriate KPIs for those, the operational procedures for EDPS, because it's going away. You know, it's just a matter of a year, maybe two, you know, depending on what the final notice says. So it's more important than ever for this data to be complete and accurate. And once we finish with our poll, you know, I have a slide that's going to show you, you know, some of the impact of that. So very, very important, you know, to make sure that you've got your appropriate KPI set, at least for volume and frequency, completeness, all those things we talked about. You know, making sure you've got that shored up, as well as, you know, thinking about that intersection of risk adjustment and quality that we are now squarely at. And so, you know, as we're moving into that space, you know, we want to make sure that we've got resources focused on that, you know, and hopefully not as much, you know, on data quality or these other things that we can deal with through appropriate key performance indicators. So let's see what we've got here for our poll results. All right, so 6% said roll back to 50-50. 18% said unchanged from 2021 at 75-25. 18% said increase EDPS to 85 and then 15% RAPS. And then the majority, 59%, said 100% EDPS. Let's get rid of RAPS already. That is the correct answer. CMS has proposed it be 100% EDPS. It remains to be seen whether or not that is the case. And right before the webinar started, you know, Kevin and I were talking about some of the discussions that RISE has, you know, as our industry advocate and our health plan advocate in dealing with CMS, because we have some folks like Sean Creighton and others as part of RISE that do the good work for us and have been discussing, you know, does it make sense, you know, to advocate for, you know, another year or so of, you know, of blending or, you know, something else, you know, just so we can, you know, continue to look at the EDPS and RAPS comparative analysis and the effect on risk scores, you know, now that hopefully health plans don't have to focus so much on data quality, because we've been doing this for a long time. So, so stay tuned in terms of what CMS, you know, eventually comes up with, and certainly let your voice be known through RISE, you know, through AHIP and, you know, other organizations, because it matters and CMS does listen. So with that, we'll pop over to the next slide, which I have titled The Consequences of a Missing or an Inaccurate Map. So this is a slide that I've used for many years, and I recently refreshed it, you know, with a more recent, you know, risk model. And I apologize that it's a little bit hard to see, but of course the number at the bottom where it says annual payment is the one you want to focus on. So here on this slide is all the justification you need for the people and processes and technology to close those operational gaps that are made evident when you set those KPIs, especially if you find yourself saying the things I've warned you not to say on the previous slide, and particularly if you want to avoid negative financial impacts from the sunsetting of RAPS. It is very easy to do this type of analysis on your own data. And we've known for years the negative financial consequences of poor management of risk adjustment operations. So this is not new. You know, most people, you know, have suffered these consequences for years, but we've been doing this a long time. So hopefully it's less of an issue than it was in the beginning. And this slide is a reminder of those consequences due to incomplete and inaccurate data. You know, because up here, you know, and this is in terms of, you know, coding conditions appropriately, this is how this presented. But this also translates into cannot get the data to CMS because it rejects due to data quality, or having to spend the time and resources writing corrective action plans because it's missing from the HEDIS calculation. So with the exponentially more complex EDPS 837 format and RAPS no longer being included in the risk score calculation, it is very critical that you invest in the resources necessary to effectively set those KPIs for your data submissions and to meet them. What is not as evident on this illustration, but is evident by CMS's issuance of these data exchange reports and HEDIS comparisons, is that we've entered that era of the intersection of risk adjustment and quality that we've known was coming. It is now more important than ever to ensure that your risk and quality operations are aligned, especially in their areas of overlap, and that key performance indicators provide those waypoints for your alignment map. The reporting issued by CMS is an excellent place to start in identifying those relevant KPIs and aligning your people, processes, and technology to efficiently achieve them. If you find that you are lacking in those people, processes, and technology, it is very easy to calculate the ROI and risk-adjusted dollars, just like we've done here, and in quality measure impact in order to justify the ask to get them. And so with that, I wanted to open the floor to questions. Of course, thank everybody for coming. Hopefully this was helpful to you. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn and always encourage people to reach out. Always happy to, talk shop, answer questions. Look for the collateral on our website, about the toolbox for the 12 best practices, if that's something that's helpful to you. But in the meantime, we will turn this over to questions.
All right. From the peanut gallery.
Yes.
All right, folks. So pop your questions in the Q&A box over here at the bottom and let us tee those up for Dawn. I have a couple for you here already. So why don't we go ahead and take a look at those.
Very good.
This question is the COVID and telehealth, telemedicine question here. So it's, asking how is COVID and telehealth going to change the payment landscape for risk adjustment in the foreseeable future? When's the shoe going to drop with that? And sort of the extended version of the question also says, what can data submission operations do to minimize the impact? What's your crystal ball here, Don?
All right, so get out my crystal ball. And so I do look at this mostly from a data submissions perspective, because that's my particular area of expertise. Because I know that there's a lot of talking, especially at our conferences, like at Rise West, there was a lot of really great discussion about the coding operations and risk analytics and things of that nature. And it was wonderful, even though it was virtual, and I learned a lot. From a submissions perspective, it's still really important to focus on complete and accurate submissions and making sure that all of the data, particularly anything that bears those HCPC and CPT codes and diagnosis codes and things related to COVID and telemedicine, that those things are actually getting to CMS and not being rejected. So it could be, and I have encouraged health plans to set a specific KPI that looks at those encounters specifically to make sure that they're not getting rejected. And if they are, addressing root causes. Perhaps it's some provider education needs to happen. Perhaps there's a claims issue happening in terms of the construction of the claim, or they're falling into a pen status for some reason because there's so much increased focus on COVID. So I would suggest closely monitoring, any of these encounters that are related to COVID, and then telehealth in general, because we know that telehealth, of course, is not going away. Even after the pandemic period passes, so to speak, telehealth is, we've seen that, a lot of services can be delivered this way, particularly for behavioral health. So you may want to segregate those and put a KPI on those to watch them, to make sure they're not getting rejected, they're not getting hung up, or otherwise problematic, so that you are not found surprised later on, when there are policy changes or, other things happen. So that's my best advice, is to keep a pair of eyes, especially on those, and KPIs set specifically to those, so that you aren't surprised later. And we know, of course, like I said, it's not going away. So this will be ongoing.
Right, great. Very good. Question here is, can you provide an example workflow for risk adjustment coders to assist with quality metrics?
So I would probably need my director of coding services, who is a national expert in her own right, and that's Monica Watson. Many of you have probably heard her speak in terms of specific coding strategies that could be used for that. So we can certainly take that question and send that to her, and have her maybe sketch out something that would work.
She
If
has
that's
a,
good,
a webinar
yeah.
that she's also done. We have in the library.
Yes.
Monica did talk to us before, so it might be good to even look that up. But yeah, if you can connect with Monica, maybe we can get something back out to our audience here. Thinking about the whole workflow process, that'd be great.
Yes, because there is an effect. I mean, like I said, now that we have entered that intersection of risk adjustment quality, there absolutely is a best path forward. And if someone is going to know it, it is going to be Monica. I think most of us would agree that's the case.
Do you have any tips on encouraging providers to use Z codes for capturing statuses, et cetera?
That's another good question for Monica. But I will say, I know that a lot of health plans are developing provider education programs that are specific for that, and deploying those resources again, so they're not surprised later by negative consequences that result from improper usage. But it does come from engaging with those providers early and often, and also setting KPIs for doing that. So
yeah,
that I can say. But Monica may have certainly a wealth of information related to that as well.
great. Well, we're gonna have a nice to-do list here for Monica.
Yes.
Is there any reason that CPT2 codes are not being used by providers routinely?
CPT2. Maybe somebody wants to provide an example. Our providers for EDPS are, of course, required to use current the HCPCS codes and CPT as given by the AMA.
Yeah.
Those are the only that are allowable, and of course HIPS codes for skilled nursing and home health. Those are currently the only allowable code sets in the industry. And certainly if anything else is used by health plans, it's not that it can't be submitted, but it would have to be mapped to an allowable CPT code. Yeah. And that we did a lot of that in the early days of EDPS. I remember working with a couple health plans way back when doing that. And then of course they phased those local codes out over time because it was too much to maintain crosswalks.
Right.
And we still do some crosswalking, like taxonomy crosswalking and things like that for RAPs. So it's not impossible, but that's the key, because CMS won't accept any other codes other than those.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, if there's any further clarification somebody has, let us know here.
Certainly if I didn't answer the question. Yeah.
Yeah. What are a few of the most impactful things independent physician groups that are capitated for risk with payers do to help ensure quality with submissions? So thinking about the independent physician groups.
So making sure, and I'm going to speak to the data submissions aspect, because of course the coding aspect is part of it. That of course is extremely, probably even more important, and some would argue from a risk adjustment perspective for providers, is making sure that the diagnoses of course are substantiated, and when they are sent to CMS and accepted for risk adjustment. So it's important to make sure I would say that, whoever is doing your submissions are doing very robust comparative analytics between EDPS and RAPS submissions. So that entails being able to use the MAO2 report, which is what's accepted and rejected, and then comparing it to the MAO4 and the diagnoses that are accepted for risk adjustment for the members, and then investigating the gaps. And there are, at least in our experiences, there's quite a few reasons for the gaps, whether it's, things are getting rejected at the 277 level, it's not a risk adjusting code, any number of reasons. So that is probably the best strategy besides addressing, the actual coding itself, doing that comparative analysis, and then the root cause of why there's gaps. And usually it lies in claims related stuff.
So it goes back to the conversation we had before we started the recording here about maintaining the RAPS analysis. Even if you're not submitting RAPS for payment purpose, but maybe, continuing, the analysis and contrast of the outputs on RAPS basis, and maybe when you're getting down to your MAO4, what's dropped out.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. I think, we've sort of run the clock out here. I think, Don, we could probably keep going for a while, but you've been very, very helpful. I think the presentation was terrific, and I hope everyone got a lot out of that. It's a great presentation, Don, and thank you so very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. So, and we appreciate Centauri Health Systems sponsoring this. This event will be recorded and put back into the library, but you will be getting an email with the slide deck that Don just presented, along with a link so you can replay the webinar here. And meanwhile, if you would please click on a few buttons here. We've got a short little quiz for you. At the very last one here is if you have any additional topics. If you say yes, you're going to hear from Tracy asking you for suggestions for future topics. So we appreciate your feedback here on this. So again, everybody, thanks for being here, attending, and everyone stay healthy, stay safe, and stay in touch. And I'll, even though I'm retiring, I hope to be able to continue to come see you guys at conferences. I'm told I have a lifetime pass for conferences. So you all take care now. And again, Don, it was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.